Welcome, everybody. I see folks coming into the webinar here, so I think we are up and running. Thank you very much for joining the third and final entry in the 2020 NASSP Virtual Advocacy Conference Series. I'm Greg Waples from NASSP's Advocacy team. Very happy to be on with you today, and I hope everybody is having a great week and looking forward to a great 4th of July weekend. So the first two webinars in the series that we already covered focus primarily on how principals and educators can advocate at the federal level with members of Congress and other lawmakers. But today's discussion is centered more around advocating with state lawmakers and at the state legislature. As you likely know, the vast majority of funding for K-12 schools comes from state and local revenue. So it's these lawmakers that also have to hear the voice of school leaders as they're making policy. While many of the best practices for contacting and influencing local, state, federal officials are all similar, there are some important nuances that we'll cover on this webinar today as well. State and local officials are often much more directly accessible than members of Congress, and there may be more opportunities to develop an intimate relationship with them. That can have a big impact on informing their views on K-12 education and keeping your school's needs in mind when they're making funding and policy decisions. Before we turn this over to today's presenters, let me just say a few words about our overall virtual conference events this year. Originally scheduled to take place in March, the 2020 NASSP Advocacy Conference had to be canceled just as the COVID-19 outbreak began sweeping across the country. The Advocacy Conference is an annual event in Washington, D.C., where hundreds of principals and educators from every state attend a day of presentation and discussion and training on advocacy best practices. And that's followed by a day of advocacy on Capitol Hill and meetings with representatives, senators, and their staff. So we know many of you were RSVP'd to attend the conference in person this year, and we're disappointed that we were unable to see you in person, but we're very pleased to be presenting some of the content that you would have seen at the conference in this virtual series. As you'll hear in today's presentation, even though in-person advocacy with lawmakers is a little bit more challenging right now during COVID-19, it's critical that we continue to seek out ways to talk to them both virtually and in person. Because education policy is going to continue to be made one way or the other. So if we're not telling our story and talking to them, then somebody else is doing it for us. As I mentioned, today's webinar is the final entry in the 3-part series. If you didn't catch either of the first 2 webinars, recordings of all 3 events are available at the link you can see on screen here, nassp.org/2020 virtual advocacy. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Today's event is meant to be interactive, so we hope all of you that are joining us on the Zoom platform will engage using the chat and Q&A features that you can see pictured on screen. If you have a question or comment at any point during the presentation, please just go ahead and type it in there. I'll keep an eye on questions and comments throughout the presentation, and our presenters will take time at the end for discussion. We also encourage you to continue today's conversation on social media. We're using the hashtag #PrinciplesAdvocate on Twitter, and we're also live streaming on Facebook right now. So if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to engage in the comments section there. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters for this important conversation on state advocacy for school leaders. First, joining us from the Human Rights Campaign, where she serves as a Deputy Campaign Director, Hope Jackson. In that role, Hope leads state legislative advocacy and electoral efforts across the South, Midwest, and Mountain West states. She works in coalition with state LGBTQ organizations and partners to advance pro-equality state legislation and fight back against legislation that would negatively impact the lives of LGBTQ Americans. Hope is also an attorney, and prior to joining HRC, she practiced law and worked in campaign management. Our 2 principal presenters on today's webinar are also NASSP state coordinators, and in that role, they help lead and coordinate grassroots advocacy on behalf of NASSP and their states. So beyond just today's webinar topic, if you're interested in getting more involved with our efforts to influence lawmakers for education, they are great people to connect with. Joining us from Bluffton High School in Indiana, where he has been the principal for the past 21 years, Steve Baker. In addition to being a state coordinator for NASSP, Steve also serves on the executive board of directors for the Indiana Association of School Principals, IASP, and he is the IASP liaison to the Indiana Department of Education. He regularly works with elected officials and encourages them to support policy that benefit principals, educators, schools, and students. And Steve was also the Indiana Principal of the Year in 2012. And finally, joining us from Anchorage, Alaska, Brendan Wilson is the principal at Begich Middle School. Brendan previously served as the principal of Wendler Middle School for 9 years and as the assistant principal of Handshoe Middle School for 3 years. Brendan is currently finishing his term as past president of the Anchorage Principals Association and also serves on the board of directors for the Alaska Association of Secondary School Principals. So a big thank you to all of you for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over first to Hope, who will start today's presentation by discussing some best practices for state level advocacy and also sharing some of the successes and lessons learned from state legislative campaigns that the Human Rights Campaign has led in recent years.
Thank you, Greg. As Greg said, I'm Hope Jackson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the Deputy Campaign Director for the Human Rights Campaign, or HRC, as most folks know it. We're the largest national LGBTQ civil rights organization fighting for lived equality for LGBTQ folks. And so we do that from the state level as well as the federal level. We also endorse pro-equality candidates and work to make sure that the folks that we're sending to our state houses or our Congress are folks who are going to vote on our issues in support of those issues. And so today I'm going to talk to you all. Can you go to the next slide, Greg, please? A little bit about impacting public policy, the ways that you'll engage your elected officials, the tools that you have at your disposal for advocacy, and then your most important tool, which is your story. And then we'll go through a bit of a case study from Tennessee. And so the goal of this is just to empower you all with the tools you need to effectively advocate for LGBTQ plus youth or youth that you're serving within your states and at every level of government. And so next slide, please. It's super important that elected officials hear from you. You're a really important messenger as a youth serving professional. And it's important that you use your unique story and the stories of others. And so when you're talking to elected officials, they need to know who you are. Not just that you're a constituent that lives in the district, but that is super important, but they need to know your story. And so as you talk to them, telling them a bit more about who you are. So whenever I go into an elected official's office, I want to talk to them about my personal life and my experience with that piece of legislation or that bill that they've signed on to, or the bill that is likely going to get on their desk. So I want to talk to them about all of those things. As a Black queer woman, it's important that I talk to them about how that bill impacts me, how that impacts my child and my family. These elected officials basically have an impact on everything that's happening within your life from every level. So that's the highest levels to members of Congress, the president, to state legislators, to local school board officials. These are all folks who impact your everyday life, and it's important that they get to know you and the work that you're doing within the community and the why when they're presenting policy. And so I would love to say have them on speed dial so that when you're engaging with them, they get used to seeing you and knowing who you are as a person, that you're not just another person that lives within their district. And because they impact so much of your life, being able to bring not only your full self to that conversation, but the stories of others is really important, whether that's youth that you serve or parents that live within a particular school district that you represent. And so being able to bring those voices along with you adds as evidence to the why or the why not for a particular piece of policy. So I want to go into the next slide and talk to you about the tools that are in your toolbox. And I'll try to spend the bulk of our time talking about some of these tools. Before COVID-19, lobby visits were probably the most bang for a buck in terms of getting in front of a lawmaker or a staffer. And I added staffer here because it's just as important that we do the same level of preparation for a meeting with a staffer that we would do for a lawmaker. And so usually these meetings are 15 to 20 minutes, 30 if we're lucky. to get enough time to sit down with a lawmaker or staffer. But I would say no matter what advocacy tool you use, especially with a lobby visit, you want to be prepared. You want to be prepared not only knowing the legislation itself, what are your talking points as it relates to that legislation, and then what are the points that the opposition would say. And so you want to be prepared to handle all of the questions you may get, but also being able to present your case, whether that's your support for a bill or your opposition of a bill, being able to articulate what it is that you want the legislator to do and connecting your story or the story of others to that piece of legislation, and then making the ask. And so I would say this has always been the most bang for a buck in terms of getting in front of a legislator or staffer and talking about our issues, because it's so much more time to make that personal connection. And also, who's going to argue with your humanity when you're sitting in front of them? And so it's a little bit easier. But given COVID-19, I think most of our lobby visits have moved into a virtual space. I wouldn't discredit this as being any less of an impact. I think it's a little bit harder to get virtual meetings with lawmakers, but it's possible. And even if it's not with that lawmaker, with a staffer from their office, you can gather a lot more folks on a virtual meeting. We have done these in the past, a few months rather, talking to lawmakers via virtual Zooms. And so it's the same preparation that would go into a lobby visit, knowing what your bills are that you want to talk about, sometimes giving those bills to the lawmaker staffer ahead of time so that they can prepare answers or give you answers, because most of the time you'll be making a direct ask. Will you support this bill? Will you oppose this bill? Can you push forth this legislation? So you want to be just as prepared. The third tool that we've also used as letters and emails, I think this is a really important tool as well. You'll be surprised the number of lawmakers who count the letters and the emails. One of the things I want to just flag here is that oftentimes as an organization, we send form letters where we've already pre-built the content and folks can add on to that letter what they want to say to make it more personal. Lawmakers sometimes frown upon those, but then also they count them as constituent contacts or contacts from within the state. And so they will take a look at those. And I would just say that for letters and emails, you want to make them just as personal as if you were hand delivering them. You can also hand deliver letters into lawmakers' offices or mail them, but making sure that there's some personal touch to that letter that connects you to it and your story. I've seen folks send pictures of themselves or their children or a person that's impacted by a specific piece of legislation. This year, we sent out a lot of emails related to anti-trans legislation that's impacting LGBTQ youth. In particular, there was an anti-trans medical care bill and an anti-trans sports bills. These bills would deny medical care for trans youth. And then the sports bill would deny them access to the sports that match their gender identity. And so we wanted to make sure that instead of adults being the face of this conversation, that it was youth that they were seeing. And so in the letters, we had a lot of youth send those out. We had parents send them out, kind of telling their story, connecting it to that particular bill and allowing the legislator to see that this is a person that you're going to impact and not just another letter in front of them. And so I think it's really important to make sure that your letters, your emails are personalized. One of the tools that folks don't use as much, but I think it's really impactful, is fax machines. You'll be surprised the number of law offices that use, like legislator offices that use fax machines, and they're usually connected. So in times where we need to really rush a campaign moment or have a rapid response, we will send things via fax. And so the number 3 fax within an hour can totally shut down an office and make folks pay attention to your issue. So whether that's emailing the chief of staff or that lawmaker's key staff member, you're going to be shutting down email, you're going to be shutting down faxes. Folks are going to start to pay attention to what's coming into their office. One of the things I've seen most recently on the Senate floor of Congress is just someone holding up the number of emails that they've received from constituents and saying, I've received 8,000 plus emails about this one bill. And so this is the way my constituents would like me to vote. And so those are really powerful moments for us as organizers in doing this work and showing that the more contact you have with a lawmaker, the more they're likely to start paying attention to what's happening and to hear you. But they also use that as evidence for their party, for the Senate floor, the House floor, to say, hey, I'm hearing from my folks about this bill and they don't agree, or they do agree and they support this, and this is why I'm going to support this bill. So the letters, the emails are really important. Another way of engaging elected officials is the public intercept. A lot of lawmakers are hosting town halls. They were hosting in-person town halls, but now they're doing public town halls. This is an opportunity, usually, if you would be at a town hall, you could approach them and ask a direct question. The key thing here is having your elevator pitch down. And so what is your story? What are you going to ask them for? And being able to articulate that within 1 to 2 minutes, because that's probably all you're going to have at the microphone or at the coffee shop when you approach them. It's really important that you approach in a respectful manner, because this is another human being you're talking to. They often get approached by folks that are a little bit more aggressive, and so that will easily shut down a conversation. But approaching in a respectful manner and saying, hey, Senator, can I have a moment of your time? I'd love to talk to you about HB 211 and its impact on my family and my friends. And so being able to talk about your bill in 1 to 2 minutes usually will get you a nice reception from that lawmaker, but it's super important that you have that elevator pitch down. I've run into quite a number of lawmakers at the coffee shop that are located around the Capitol. And so it's important that that's going to be your moment. You want to make sure you shine in that moment and tell them what you need them to know. And then phone calls. Right now, I think most of us are doing a lot of phone calling, talking to folks, but this is another important tool. These are counted as well by staffers. If you're shutting down their phone lines, I think it's important that they take note of the information that's coming in. And it's the same thing as with your public intercept. You have 1 to 2 minutes to tell them your story and your why. And so being able to ID yourself as a constituent, identify the issue, and then again, make that direct ask. And then social media. I think it's really important right now, given that we can't get into offices as quickly as we'd like to, being able to add pressure on social media. A lot of our campaigns begin this way. And so if there is a bill or a policy that's coming up and you want to shed some light on it, having your members and your supporters or folks within your network just send out tweets or send out Facebook posts with the hashtag of that particular bill or policy, and being able to just put a spotlight on it. I think that that also gets lawmakers to pay attention. And for those of us who can do that without any C4 or C3 issues happening, I think it's really important to highlight it in that way on social. And you can add the particular legislator, and that way they're paying attention as they come in. And then I think just the final tool is grass tops. So with grassroots, that's more about individuals coming together to build power, whereas grass tops are these individuals that have the power to go in and influence a lawmaker and get a sit down with them. And so usually it's a business leader, a faith leader, it can be an educator, folks who are likely gonna get the attention of that lawmaker a lot quicker than little old Hope coming in and saying, hey, I live in your district, I wanna talk to you. But if it's a IBM or a Google or one of those major corporations, or a faith leader from the community who's well respected and well known, they're more likely to get a sit down 5 to 10 minute with that lawmaker, to talk about the issues. And so the level of preparation that goes into that meeting is probably more versus with a lobby visit. You want to prep for everything that that business leader or that faith leader is going to talk about, but it's going to be from the perspective of that business leader. What's the business impact? You want to equip them with that information. For a faith leader, it's the same thing. Being able to bring that faith voice has been really important to our work as well. in talking about LGBTQ issues. And so it's super important when you're thinking about the grass tops that you're selecting.
I hope if I could interject quickly with a question from the chat here. Jennifer is asking, given all of HRC's work around the landmark gay marriage Supreme Court decision, if one of these tactics in particular was most effective leading up to that. Obviously, it's a little different when you're dealing with the Supreme Court and justices, but wondering if any of these tactics were effective in drawing attention to the issue, or even in the year or so leading up to that decision.
I think it was our lobby visits and then our social media presence. And it's not just HRC, it's a kind of a coalition of folks and organizations that we work with quite a bit. I think the lobby visits were really powerful because it sends a message. It shows a picture of how much work has happened as it relates to marriage equality. HRC has 32 steering committees across the country, and each year we come together for 2 lobby visits on the Capitol. And so what that looks like is hundreds of people wearing our little pins, our HRC flags, that are going in to meet with lawmakers. And so they know that day on the Capitol, we're going to be talking about our issues. And I think in particular around marriage equality, we had a lot of lobby visits with folks who we knew were champions on our issues, but also folks who we knew were leaning, or possible folks that would jump across the line and support us. And so I think the same thing as it relates to the Supreme Court, just being able to have a lot of visits, not necessarily with SCOTUS, but having a lot of visit with Congress members or leaders who are going to get the attention. And so grass tops were equally important. Even in the most recent decision for SCOTUS around employment, it was super important that we use those grass top voices that are closer to the decision makers. And so I would say those two, the lobby visits and then the grass tops voices, were really important to moving the needle on some of those victories in equality.
Great, thank you.
So your most important tool is your story. I think I would say this is if you have nothing else down, you have to have your story. And no one's gonna argue with you about who you are and what you're saying. They shouldn't, they don't know your story. And so it's really hard to argue with that. I think it's important that you know how to connect your story to the issue. And so you always want to start with the introduction. My name is Hope Jackson. I'm from Southern California. And your story could be, the trees are burning and we really need to stop the trees from burning. But you need to have a sense of urgency around your issue. As it relates to LGBTQ issues, I feel like there's always an urgency because these bills are quickly moving, and these bills have a really detrimental impact on LGBTQ folks, in particular trans youth, from what we've seen this past year. And so being able to connect that story and to talk about who this bill is impacting, whether that's LGBTQ youth or LGBTQ adults, you want to be able to talk about these issues in a way that articulates to that lawmaker, this is personal, I'm going to tell you why it's urgent, and I'm going to ask you to vote no on this bill, or I'm going to ask you to co-sponsor this bill. And so I think these are the 4 points I would just say are really critical to talking to any elected official, is knowing how to introduce yourself as a constituent or as a supporter of the Human Rights Campaign or another organization, connecting your story and giving it a sense of urgency, and then making that ask. You always want to end with an ask and get an answer. Sometimes you will get an answer. Sometimes it will be, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. But even if that is your answer, following up with these same elements in an email or a letter is super important, so that they know you're going to be coming back to them each time again to talk about these issues. And so telling your story, I think, is the critical component to all of the advocacy tools that we have in our toolbox. And so I would say practice your story for a 15-minute conversation, but also be prepared for a 1 to 2 minute conversation, elevator pitch, so to speak, when talking to lawmakers. And so I'll just be really quick because I don't want to take up too much more time here. Just a case study in talking about Tennessee. This year, we fought back against 11 anti-LGBTQ bills. In Tennessee, they have companion bills. So what looks like 22 bills is really 11. They're just as bad either way. I think this year we were able to defeat all but one of the bills. And the bill that passed was HB 836. It's a license to discriminate in child welfare. So that bill basically would impact LGBTQ couples or LGBTQ youth who are in foster care and adoption. And so this is one of the bills we fought back really hard against. This year, we also saw a lot of restrictions around trans youth, bills that will restrict bathroom access, access to sports teams, medical care bans, and then even bans on LGBTQ materials in libraries. So this year was a big year for anti-LGBTQ bills in Tennessee. It's not unlike any other year. I think this year was much more surprising because of the number of bills as it relates to trans youth. So some of the tools that we use, lobby visits. I spent a lot of time in lawmakers' offices this year before COVID. So Tennessee gets started in January, and from January to March, we spent quite a bit of time at lobby days on the Hill. Legislator events, there were quite a number of events that happened for particular legislators, but this is a really key time for us to jump in and have those really sidebar conversations about bills, getting thoughts on what's going to happen. We also did email and call campaigns. We do a lot of rapid response text messaging to lawmakers. And so this year, I would say we sent out more than 2,000 to 3,000 text messages to specific targeted lawmakers. We also sent out emails and then postcards. You'll be surprised the number of stacks of postcards that are collected at random events that we've done, and folks want to make sure that their lawmaker is hearing from them, and sometimes we deliver the messages. So we stack all the postcards together. It becomes a picture for social media. We use it in a number of ways. It also becomes this moment at the Capitol where we're walking in with all of these postcards in petition with a sign and to say, hey, these are the folks that are against this anti-LGBTQ legislation. And then we take those pictures and we use them on social media. So really thinking about the ways that you can layer in advocacy with one action is kind of how we try to structure our campaigns as it relates to anti-LGBTQ legislation. And then in thinking about just the voices that we bring to the table, or that we brought to the table with Tennessee, and the reason we were so successful there, we had LGBTQ youth, parents, and allies speak on the issues. We also look to educators and child welfare professionals to come in and give testimony, to speak to lawmakers in lobby visits one-to-one. And then we looked a lot to business and faith leaders. This year, we did a business letter with Google, with Amazon, a couple of other like Postmates, lots of big business names that lawmakers are going to pay attention to. And so that letter was really effective after the passage of HB 836 to say to lawmakers, hey, you've passed one bad bill, do not let another pass. And so that letter was really powerful in making sure that lawmakers know in the back of their mind that businesses are paying attention and they want to make sure that nothing else gets through. Medical doctors were really important because these issues related to medical care. And so having those voices talk about the standard of care and what's approved was really important. And then finally, Taylor Swift, having a celebrity voice, if nothing else, will get you attention. And so sometimes just finding the right messenger. Taylor Swift is from Tennessee, is often there. She's a big country music star, pop star. And so folks are paying attention when Taylor Swift tweets out, I'm going to support Tennessee Equality Project because they're in the fight against anti-LGBTQ legislation. And so just thinking about those voices that are key to bring to the table when you're talking to lawmakers is really important, and then the tools that you're going to use. And so I think that's it for me in terms of just key items to engage lawmakers.
Thank you very much, Hope. That was really insightful and useful, I think. It's great to hear from another organization besides just an education group about how you approach state advocacy. And I think, there's a lot we can learn from that in the work that we're doing as well. So we'll now move the presentation over to Steve Baker, who again is the principal of Bluffton High School in Indiana. Steve is a seasoned advocate who has lots of experience working with state and federal policymakers, so he'll build on some of the best practices that Hope discussed and offer some really practical guidance for approaching and building relationships with elected officials.
Well, thanks, Greg. And hello, everyone. And welcome. Hello from Indiana, where the weather is very nice today. Great job, Hope. That was some very good information. Thank you for all of that. Yeah, right off the bat, if you want to go ahead and advance that slide, Greg, right off the bat, it's things I want to talk about that we can do at the state level that's a little more difficult to do at the federal level. You can do it. This is something set up that is meant to be easier done at the state level. I know when I did this 21 years ago and I got involved, I was intimidated. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know where to start. I didn't have any people from NASSP having tips on advocacy. I had to just learn it myself. And so when you get into it, it's very intimidating. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. So you really can do this, especially starting off at the state level. That might be more of a comfort zone. So first of all, they are easier to contact. For me in Bluffton, Indiana, a small town of about 8,000, I'm within an hour of all of my state legislators. And they have town meetings right there in Bluffton, 3 minutes away from my house that I can go and visit them, visit their town hall meetings, get up afterwards and say hi to them, have a cup of coffee with them afterwards if they have time, but they're more accessible. It's easier to reach out to them and them to reach out to you. I have regular coffee and lunch meetings with the state legislators, both my representatives and senators. Just last week, I had lunch with my state representative, and he lives 20 minutes away, and we alternate coming to my town and going to his town. And I couldn't do that always with the federal legislators. So they're much more accessible. We just enjoy having lunch, and we had a good talk. We even talked about COVID-19. It was just a good time to talk outside of session for him to hear from me and me to hear from him. There's also a lot of hometown connections that you have with the state legislators that you may not, again, have at the federal legislators. For example, one of my state legislators, my uncle, and he have a similar interest in cars. And so that helped me make a connection with that individual and allowed me to have a more casual conversation, and one that kind of opened the door to having a conversation with him. And again, ever since, we've been meeting and things have been going very well. I have a friend in Bluffton that helped me get connected to my next legislator that I wanted to have meetings with. I didn't know the person as well, and this my friend did, and he connected me. And again, it's easier to do. You just have more of those connections, more of those contacts at the state level. So take advantage of those. I even had a daughter who worked as a legislative assistant as well. So when I call the legislative assistant, I can always make that connection and say, well, my daughter worked in that capacity, so I understand the things that you are dealing with, and, you know, talking with high school principals who are calling and want to meet with your representative. I get that, but it just gave me that connection in order to have a meeting set up. So again, it's a little easier to contact, little easier to meet. And again, I think it's a little easier to visit. It's easier for me to go down to Indianapolis, Indiana, 2 hours away, than to Washington, D.C., which is about 9 hours away. I love going to D.C. I love our advocacy efforts that we do at the federal level, NASSP, but I can go down to Indy on a more regular basis. Hope said it best. Email is a good form of communication, but there's nothing like stopping by. Of course, when COVID-19 lifts for us a little bit, but there's nothing like stopping by, making those connections, having a conversation, and putting a face with a name. And again, being nice goes a long way. First of all, because it's the right thing to do, but second of all, you're greeted more warmly instead of coming in demanding things. And again, going down to visit my state association, IASP, Indiana Association of School Principals, every year we have one of our board meetings at the State House. So principals from all over the state of Indiana will come to Indianapolis, and we will have a state legislator come and talk to us. Again, it's easier to visit that way. And they'll talk to us. We'll usually have somebody from an education committee come and talk to us. And we're even thinking now next year, you ready for this, Greg, is we're going to do what NASSP does. we're thinking about setting up meetings with our state legislators and letting board members have meetings during the day. We'll be there. We'll help coordinate it so it's not intimidating. And we'll have a day of just, here we're going to set up a time for you and come meet your legislator. We'll have a little bit of training. And again, it's easier to do those visits at the state level than at the federal. And I learned a lot from advocating at the federal level and brought that back home with me at the state level. So where does that go? Where does that lead to? Well, the next slide, Greg, is what we want to get to the point, and that is, how do we build these relationships with legislators? Well, you know what? It's the same question. How do we make friends? And there's a lot of similarities there. You know, you have to spend time with them. You have to spend time to earn their trust. And you have to remember that, you know, relationship is a two-way street. And that's important because no one likes to feel used. No one likes to feel, oh, you only call me when you want something. I will literally go have lunch with my state legislators, and I will tell them this up front. I say, I have no agenda. And I really don't. My agenda is I have no agenda. Let's just talk. Let's just have lunch. What's going on with you? He wants to know what's going on with me. And it's just, again, it's a two-way street. Spending time with them. Hope said it very, very well. They really do want to hear your story. You have a story that only you can tell. If I were a state legislator and I were, let's say, be put on an insurance committee, I'm not an expert in that. So I probably want to hear from people who make their living in the insurance industry. And I would probably listen to them a little closer because they live it every day. That's the advantage we have. So they want to hear from us. They want to hear our story. They want to know what's happening in our schools and those stories that connect them with what they do at the state legislature, in my case, in Indianapolis. Principal for a Day is what we call it in Indiana, but it's also called shadow visits at the NASSP level. And either way, basically, the idea is the same. Invite them to come to your school for any reason. Again, at the state level, I think it's a little easier. And you can invite them. For example, we got a few awards at Bluffton High School, and they came in. They loved presenting those awards. They loved it. We loved it. Media was there. Everybody won in that situation. We also have a time for them to come in for Principal for a Day. I've been principal, like I said, for 21 years, and all but 2 years, I've had a Principal for a Day, or Principal for half a day, or Principal for give me 2 hours. And here's the thing, I have never been turned down. The 2 years we didn't do it, that was on my end, not their end. I just couldn't swing it. But I've never been turned down. And again, it seems intimidating, but again, they want to come to your buildings. I've had federal and state legislators be part of that. I've had our mayor, our police chief. I've had a media personality, someone who does our local news. I had them. I had our state superintendent, state education advisor for the governor. That was the most recent one. And then there is a gentleman that I become friends with. He lives 2 hours away, so I am not his constituent. He is not my state senator, but he is involved very heavily in education on the Senate Education Committee, and we've become friends. And I just took a shot, and I said, hey, how about this coming year? You want to be principal for a day at Bluffton High School? Well, the thing is, I'm not his constituent, but he's going to travel 2 hours, and we're going to try to find a date where he's going to come up, and he wants to do that. And so that's great. Like I said, I've not been turned down yet. They love that. And when you do these things, you have to do your homework. Again, Hope alluded to that and did a good job. You got to know where the power is. I understand titles. I get that. But who has the power? Who has the power and the authority to do different areas of education? In Indiana, every state's different. At the federal level, it's different. But you got to get to know your chairs of education. For me, in the House and in the Senate, 2 individuals, you need to know each of them. What authority do they have? And sometimes it's not with legislators. Sometimes it's with my Department of Education, state superintendent. Sometimes it's with the governor's office. Sometimes it's with the governor's workforce cabinet. So you have to know who your players are. You have to know who has the authority to make those decisions. So you have to do your homework, and you have to know what is important to your legislators. What committees are they on? What do they feel passionate about? And can you be part of that? I always believe in being proactive. It's a big word for me. I love to be proactive on education issues as well. I want to find out what they are, and I always try to talk to my legislator ahead of a bill. If I'm going to present, if I'm going to give public comment on it, I want to contact them first and say, hey, I want you to know I'm supporting this bill and here's why. Or I may contact them and say, I just want you to know I have some concerns about this. I'm giving you a heads up. I'm going to be opposed to this, but I want you to know why. And again, they respect that. I've done my homework, and they know that I'm going to represent my students and do what is best for them. So that interaction, that building relationship, it's just like trying to have a friend. You have to spend time. You have to earn their trust. And again, it's a two-way street. That is so important. A great question, and Hope is right. You want to go in and you have an ask. You know, you want to ask something, but that's exactly right. And on top of that, I always say, what can I do for you? What can I do for you? Well, how can I help you? Is there any education stuff that's coming up you got questions on? Are there any committees that I love serving on committees? I'm a little crazy like that. But what can I do for you? How can I help you? So that's how we stay in touch with our state legislators. And I want to give a shout out to NASSP. We now in Indiana do the phone to action that was started at NASSP. And now Indiana does that. So that's one more way to communicate with our state legislators. And again, build that relationship, build that trust. It does take time, but it is very worth it. And I would say it is easier to do at the federal level. Both are important, but step in there, get your feet wet. The more you do it, the more comfortable you will be.
That's great. Thank you very much, Steve. That's really excellent practical advice, and especially building those relationships. And, you know, advocacy isn't just an ask to a lawmaker. It's about getting to know them, and that will make our ask much more impactful. So our final presenter for today's presentation is Brendan Wilson, who again is the principal at Begich High School, or Begich Middle School, excuse me, in Alaska. I'm sure many of you who are on today's presentation are not only NASSP members, but also members of your state school leader association. And state principal associations like the Alaska Association of Secondary School Principals have an impactful voice in the legislature. So Brendan's going to focus a little bit more on some specific strategies that the state organization itself, working with its members, can take to implement and maximize policy influence.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Hope and Steve. One of the favorite things for me about being a principal and being a state coordinator is how impressive my colleagues are. So I really enjoyed the beginning of this presentation. My part of the presentation today is going to focus on, as Greg alluded to, two specific aspects of state level advocacy that we've been doing in Alaska. The first one is the creation and use of joint position statements in our advocacy. And I'll spend most of my time on that. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about a state level advocacy conference that we do in Alaska. And I'll share how both of those are similar to the NASSP versions, but also unique to the context of our state. You can go to the next slide, please, Greg. Thank you. We call these joint position statements because the Alaska Association of Secondary Principals partners with three other organizations: our elementary counterparts, the State Superintendent's Organization, and ALASBO, which is the Association for School Finance Officers. All of these groups are covered under the umbrella organization of the Alaska Council of School Administrators, and then each one of our organization's presidents takes turns being president of ACSA. Next slide. Every year, representatives from all of our associations form a committee to revise our joint position statements. This might include deciding that we need to create a new position statement. It might be adjusting an existing one, or it might be our favorite activity, which is deciding to retire one after we've been successful. Our position statements are tailored each year for the coming legislative session, so those are always dynamic and timely. Next slide, please. Typically, our work starts in the spring for the next year's position statement, and the committee meets and evaluates our existing statements. Then we divide the work into subcommittees. Then over the summer months, groups meet together electronically to collaborate and then come back together as a large committee to get feedback. Because of the unique geography of Alaska, we've actually been doing this work remotely since we began. Before we had Zoom, we did this work on the phone. And so this work culminates with a breakout session at our annual States Principals Conference every year in October. And that's where we give every secondary principal in the state and every superintendent in attendance an opportunity to provide feedback and suggestions. Next slide, please, Greg. Actually, could you go back one slide? I got ahead. So this, the previous slide was what the top of the finished product looks like. There we go. It's professionally printed on sturdy cardstock. It's about 5 by 9 inches or so it's easy to tuck in a folder or a purse and carry with you. Like many rural states, Alaska has been dealing with competing interests between our urban centers and our rural areas. And so these statements can help us focus on common issues that we can all agree on and provide one powerful voice. To be very candid, there have been some times when I've worked on these over the past 3 or 4 cycles where I might get frustrated that the superintendent's group or the finance group wants to kind of dial something down that principals really feel strongly about. But it's really important to realize that each one of our groups brings a different understanding to the table, and more importantly, a different set of relationships with government, including our local governments. And so this gives us an opportunity to really have a unified and consistent voice. And it's led to some successes that I will highlight a little later. I find these really useful in prepping for meetings with legislators, obviously, but they're equally valuable for preparing for meetings with school board members, assemblymen, or city or village leaders. I myself keep one on my desk so that if I'm talking with someone in the media, I have them to refer to. But where I've actually used them most frequently is in talking with other principals, mostly principals in my own district. It's not at all unusual for NASSP to send out an advocacy alert, and when I send those out to our members, I often have the opportunity to highlight how those issues interact or overlap with our issues in Alaska. We also have a section on these every year donated to federal issues, so these come along with us when we travel to Washington for our national advocacy. Now I'm ready for the next slide. Like NASSP's position statements, ours are online so that administrators or anyone who is interested can follow the progress of this legislation as it's happening. So here's an example of a long-time Alaska issue that's really gaining some traction at a federal level as well, increasing internet access and bandwidth. That's particularly important in rural Alaska, and we've been making some headway there. And if you want to check this out later, those links are live. So if you want to watch the recording and look at how those present themselves, please feel free to come back to it later. Next slide. I thought I'd share an example of how a statement changes over time. So I'll give you a moment to read this one. I chose this one for a few reasons, but the biggest reason is probably that it was almost reverse engineered in that we noticed that legislators, when we were doing our advocacy visits, were bringing this topic up with us. So we decided it was time for a joint position statement on it. I want to do a shout out to Greg because NASSP was working on their position statement on this same topic at the same time, and he provided some guidance for me that was really valuable. Let's go to the next slide so you see how it changed. So here's the current slide. It's not a lot different. The biggest difference is in the second paragraph, the way that we worded the request for funding support. One of the things that was really challenging about this position statement is that while it's something that makes sense, when you're advocating for something, you want to have an ask in mind, as Hope and Steve already alluded to. And so it was kind of difficult to narrow it down to what we were really asking for with this position statement. So I expect that this one's going to continue to evolve until it's down to a specific ask, such as a counselor for every school or something like that. I also want to spend just a minute talking about our grass top efforts. I really like that phrase. Hope I'm going to steal that in the future. This is our annual legislative fly-in, and unlike Steve's state, we can't all drive to our capital. In fact, none of us can drive to our capital. So once a year, we organize a state-level version of an advocacy conference, and that includes all our partner organizations. Each member's organization's president gets a moment to address the full group and highlight our advocacy work, which is often grounded in those joint position statements. And then we typically have a full day of professional development. Lisa, our executive director, does a great job getting guest speakers who are policymakers or influencers, legislators and cabinet members to come speak with us. We get some coaching on doing legislative visits, similar to what tips you got today. And we also get some coaching on how to testify to legislative committees. Like the national event, the culmination is a series of visits to our legislative offices. And I'm going to add a couple tips there that we found useful. If you can afford to send extra members, if travel costs aren't too prohibitive, one thing that we found really effective in Anchorage is sending people in pairs so that when someone's going for the first time to talk with legislators, they're with an experienced advocate. Another thing that I'd like to encourage you to know about, and I think both Hope and Steve talked about it, is pay attention to which committees your legislators that you're talking to are on, because it's not unusual for them to ask you questions about things that they're working on. For example, one time I walked into a legislator's office who was very pro-education, and I was kind of surprised. She said, I don't have a lot to talk with you about today because I'm on resources. And I was able to say, well, actually, that sounds really interesting. Tell me a little about resources, and there may be some overlap. And we did find some areas where there was some overlap. And then I took the opportunity to let her know that there were some votes coming up that I would like her to be watching. I'd like to highlight a few successes. The first one, this one's really dear to our hearts as principals. Like many of you, we've had difficulty filling openings in the past few years, and this bill allowed us to temporarily hire retired teachers to fill those hard to fill openings. It used to be that once an employee retired from Alaska's system, they weren't allowed to do a long-term sub position while also drawing retirement benefits, but this bill allowed us to reverse that and utilize this really valuable resource of experience for handling those last minute or hard to fill openings. This was also a major win for us, achieving forward funding for education in Alaska. We've been steadfastly advocating this with our legislature for many, many years, because too many times our state has dragged out the budget process and extended the session well into the summer. And so that results in a lot of uncertainty where we've had to pink slip and lay off teachers, ultimately driving many of them down to you in the lower 48. So as our last governor was leaving office, he signed a forward funding bill for 2 years, and that went into the next governor's term. And that governor then sued because he didn't believe a prior legislature could hold his administration responsible for funding. But I'm pleased to let you know that the courts recently supported us. And then I've already mentioned our last recent success. This just happened in March, internet funding. And this bill requires the state to ensure a minimum speed of internet service for every school district in Alaska. And that is something that became really crucial with COVID-19. And I know that's not just an issue in Alaska, but it's an issue everywhere. And so just closing out my portion of the presentation, as Hope and Steve pointed out, none of these tools are a replacement for relationships. Relationships with legislatures need to be primary. I don't just walk into a legislator's office and hand them our JPS. Sometimes I don't even talk with them about issues. But it's nice to have those tools along with me so I can scan them before I go in. So I'm grounded in those issues in case something does come up. But again, the fundamental thing is to really just get conversations started, tell the story of your school, and establish that trust.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. I love that example of the position statement process that Alaska has. I think there's so many of NASSP state affiliate organizations that could really model that and benefit from that. So thank you very much for sharing. We have a few minutes left for Q&A here. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to type it into the chat feature in Zoom and we'll get to it. I did see a couple of comments as the presentation was moving along related to COVID-19. Obviously, that's top of mind for all administrators right now as we're looking to reopen buildings in the fall. You know, it's going to be a mixture of remote learning and actual students in the building, and that's going to look very different from state to state. But Steve and Brendan, I'm wondering if the folks on this webinar, as they're preparing to take all of these best practices that you've shared and approach state lawmakers in the coming weeks and months, what should they be telling those lawmakers about what schools are facing right now related to COVID and what they need?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question, Greg. And I go back to my most recent lunch meeting I had with a state representative. He just had a meeting with his some of his fellow state representatives, and they were talking about the same issues we are, like how are we going to reopen schools? What about remote learning? What will that look like for students and parents who choose not to come back to school? What about all the procedures? And it was interesting because I said, well, you know, that's interesting because that's exactly what we're talking about. So we connected our two worlds. He wanted to know, we talk about this down in Indianapolis. What does this look like at Bluffton High School? And I was able to share that. And I think he was very appreciative that we were able to connect that for him and gave him some information so we can go back and say, now I know what this looks like in a school. And then I asked him, what's this look like down at the State House? As we go down this path, what are you guys thinking? Funding, training, how are you looking at this? And it was just really good to see the two thoughts merge and see it from another perspective.
That's helpful. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and I would add, it just goes back to telling your story. So if a legislator were to ask a question or I'd have the opportunity, I would share that at my school, we have beyond the tech distribution issue and equal access to technology, there are also equity issues with the kind of family situations that our kids are in. So specifically, I would share that many of our students, when they're on Zoom, leave their cameras off because they don't want their teachers or friends to see what's going on in their homes. I might also share a cute story about a group of 7th graders that managed to put on a play during Zoom time for all their classmates, a play that they wrote and produced themselves.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, I mean, I think telling your stories is the most important thing right now. These legislators are going to be making policy, you know, not just before the school year, but as the school year goes on and we continue to deal with this pandemic. So they're going to have updates on what's happening in the schools and what you all are facing. So it's really important, I think, now more than ever to get in front of them. And then Hope, one final question I have for you. You shared some great examples of some of the legislative victories in Tennessee that HRC has achieved recently. I know we have a lot of advocates with NASSP who are interested in partnering on this type of work. Where can folks go? Where can school leaders go individually to partner with HRC on these efforts? Or if they're a state principals association, how can they partner with some of those coalitions you were talking about?
So you can always learn more about HRC's work across the states by reaching out to me at hope.jackson@hrc.org. You can also reach out to our All Children's, All Families Foundation team. Ellen Kahn is our director of that team, and Ellen is always looking for folks to be a part of the work. So Ellen's email is ellen.kahn@hrc.org. Each year, HRC hosts Time to Thrive, which is an LGBTQ and allied youth conference that we usually put on. We talk to educators across the country about issues impacting LGBTQ plus youth. And so that's another opportunity just to hear from folks from different education associations and to be a part of that as well. And so that's usually hosted with HRC in partnership with the NEA. And so that's another opportunity for folks to get engaged. But I'm happy to share any and all information about the work that we're doing and really get you involved if you're interested.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I think we're gonna have to leave it there for Q&A because we're just about at time here. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation and their excellent presentation in today's discussion. And as we conclude our virtual advocacy conference, I would just want to give one more call to action. We've talked about this on our last couple of virtual advocacy conference events. NASSP is doing one of those action alerts right now that both Brendan and Steve alluded to. That will connect you directly with your lawmakers and send a message. This is to our federal lawmakers, but still something very important. And that is on the homework gap, an issue that's incredibly critical right now during COVID-19. So many students do not have reliable home internet access, and they need that to learn remotely. We just simply can't risk millions of students falling behind because they don't have that internet access during this time. So we're asking Congress to provide additional funding for the FCC's E-rate program so that we can get more hotspots into families' homes and enable those students to connect and learn during this time. So if you want to help us send a message, simply text the phrase E-rate to the phone number 52886. You'll get a text and click the link and you'll see this field on the right. You just enter your information, click preview email, and you can either send the email to members of Congress as is, or you can customize it, as Hope was talking about, would be a best practice to kind of personalize your message and make sure that lawmakers are hearing from an individual and not a completely formed response every time. So, but if you can help us with that, again, text E-rate to 52886 and help send a message to Congress. So this concludes our 2020 NASSP Virtual Advocacy Conference. I want to thank all of you for joining us for all three sessions and today as well. You can access the recordings to all three of these on our website at nassp.org/2020 virtual advocacy. Also, as we approach the 2021 Advocacy Conference, please continue to check back on the website for updates on what's happening there. I want to thank Hope, Steve, and Brendan one more time for their excellent presentation. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today. Stay safe and be well.